All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to the ninth session of Black or African American history with me, The Forecast. And I definitely appreciate everybody for coming through, for listening. I appreciate everybody for your support. If you have any questions or, I'm missing anything or you want to add anything, feel free to add to the discussion. And like I always say, man, think about creating your own kind of curriculum, whether it be finance, some kind of history, math, science, whatever it is that you specialize in, just think about putting something together as a curriculum for yourself. And hopefully we can put these together to recapture our minds, in the minds of our community. So last time we left off, we looked at the end of their Revolutionary War, right? And we saw what happened with the black folk who sided with the British, right? We saw what happened with the black folks who sided with the Americans. And pretty much it was a tough situation either way. But we also saw some of the influence that their Revolutionary War had on black people and their desire to be free and their will to fight for freedom get that much more inflamed, right? But we also saw that they realized they had to do stuff for themselves. And we talked about people like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and all the mutual aid societies that black people were forced to create, right? That we still need to create to this day, but, they actually did it in the 1700s. But, this is where we pick up our lesson after their war, when Britain had to recognize America as its own nation. This is the part when they came up with their Constitution. Now, they say they wanted a stronger central government with more control over the states, which at the time the states was pretty much seen as basically might as well be different countries. Because, each colony was kind of doing its own thing. But they wanted a central government to control it all. And so that's when they split up their power with the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of their government. And I'm not going to go into deep in all that stuff. And if you want to learn about, their government and all of that stuff, I encourage you to do so. But you can learn that at any European course. So a regular American course. But anyway, when we looking at it from our perspective, right, here you have these hypocritical thugs who they call founding fathers writing a document talking about all men are created equal when all of them own slaves, and it's probably slaves right there in the room with them.
It is possible to make the argument that Thomas Jefferson is the first person to truly articulate a theory of race in the United States. And in effect, he has to do so. He has said in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. Well, if in fact we're all created equal, and if in fact we're entitled to our liberty, then how can he possibly own 175 slaves and going up to about 225 slaves at the peak of his slaveholding?
In notes, Jefferson's words appeared to justify slavery at a time when many were admonishing the Founding Fathers for espousing freedom, while continuing to support a system of human bondage.
The problem that they had to figure out is how can we promote liberty, freedom, democracy on the one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of peoples who are non-white on the other.
And the way you do that is to say, yeah, but there's something different about these people. This whole business of inalienable rights, that's fine, but it only applies to certain people.
The moment when we become a nation is critical for our understanding of both American nationality and race. We accept the notion that all men are created equal, but then perhaps some of those people who are enslaved are not quite men. That is, we'll keep our ideas of American nationality, but we'll write certain people out of the human family.
Now, as for the Constitution, the original document never actually mentioned the word slave one time. But when they were referring to black people, they did have a clause in it called the 3/5 Compromise, or the 3/5 Clause. Now, since the South had a lot more plantations, they had more slaves in total than the North had. Now, the thing is, when they were talking about how they were going to set it up, the Southern states wanted to count slaves in the population so that they have higher representation. But at the same time, they didn't want to have extra taxes from that population because they didn't consider them humans. And even though they still wanted to use the population for representation, of course, black people would not be represented in any of that. Now, the North, who a lot of people claim was so benevolent and where all of these abolitionists were, but the North was against that, saying that, well, slaves are nothing but property, no more than cattle, and should not be counted in the population, therefore should not be represented in the vote as far as how many representatives that state has. And the truth is, way before the Civil War, the South was ready to secede from the Union before the Union was even official. But eventually they did end up coming up with the compromise, which was the 3/5 Compromise.
And now we can get ready for the 3/5 Compromise. Because in order to determine a state's representation for the House of Reps, we need to know their population. So the Constitution sets that every 10 years we do what's called a census. And we're like, 1, 2, 3, there are 100,000 people in Alabama. And what that does is it does two things. Number one, that population number allows us to determine the direct taxes that state's going to pay. But more importantly, for our discussion of the 3/5 Compromise, it determines the representation they get in the House of Representation. How many congressmen they are going to be able to send to Washington, D.C. to represent the interest of that state. And the controversy occurs not between small states and large states, but between southern states and northern states, and specifically on how do we count slaves. And the South wants it two ways. Number one, when it comes to counting slaves, they don't want to count them when it comes to direct taxes. They want to make sure that they are treated as property then, because the more population have, the more the direct taxes you're going to pay, and that's going to hurt them. But when it comes to representation, suddenly the South's like, slaves are people, slaves are people, because the more pop you get, the more rep you get, and the more power you get in Congress. And the North is like, hell no, slaves don't count. Slaves don't count because the more slaves, the more power, and we don't have any slaves. So at the end of the day, the fraction that you get, and I'm getting nauseous as I get ready to say the word, is the 3/5 fraction, compromise. For every 5 slaves, when we do the census, we're going to count like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3. 6, 7, 8, 9, 6. For every 5 slaves, you get 3 people. And those people can be counted for your census, your population, and you can get representation off them. So the ironic part of this is that the South is going to get representation from their slaves so they can send that representation to Congress in order to keep their slaves slaves. Now, if we never had the 3/5 Compromise, there's a good chance that a lot of American history would be different. Thomas Jefferson probably wouldn't have won the election of 1800. The Indian Removal Act probably would not have happened. Andrew Jackson would not have been able to veto the National Bank. We probably would not have had our compromises that pushed the Civil War off for another 50 or 60 years. So the 3/5 Compromise is pretty darn important when it comes to understanding not only the Constitution and the Convention and compromise, but also really, I believe, sectionalism and the Civil War.
So in reality, what the 3/5 Clause is saying is that for every 5 black people, right, that's equivalent to 3 white people, right? So it would take 5 black people to do something that would be equal to 3 white people doing it. Essentially saying the labor of 5 black people is the equivalent of 3 white people working. So you know how they say, well, you got to work twice as hard to be good as them. That's not true. They still see you the same way anyway, right? Not as good as them. Now, there was another clause in the Constitution that forbid this federal government from outlawing slavery for at least 20 years until 1808.
Even though the South would have loved for black people to fully count for political purposes, this legislative compromise, which turned black people into fractions, came to serve as a larger metaphor for the way that black people were seen by many as less than human. The implications of this decision were profound. It changed the dynamics of the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise, some historians even argue that Thomas Jefferson would have never won the election of 1800. The Three-Fifths Compromise wasn't the only negotiation about what slavery would look like in the new United States. The Slave Trade Clause was outlined in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Though it doesn't use the word slave, it was one of the original provisions of the Constitution that addressed slavery as a policy issue. The text says, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person." This is basically a really fancy way of saying that the federal government cannot limit how many individuals were imported to the United States. According to legal scholars Gordon Lloyd and Jenny S. Martinez, when they said any such persons, they clearly meant enslaved people of African descent. They also point out that this clause was created to be another compromise between the northern and southern colonies. It allowed for slavery to exist in the South, where it directly sustained the economy, and allowed for slavery to remain illegal at the local level, where it had already been abolished. But what it did allow was for all the colonies to indirectly, economically benefit from slavery. And the fact that so many across the country, North and South, benefited financially from slavery is part of what allowed it to sustain itself for so long. Some states, like Georgia and South Carolina, had a unique reliance on the transatlantic slave trade because their enslaved workers died at higher rates relative to places like Virginia or Maryland. They were particularly insistent on this point, so much that some feared they wouldn't join the Union if there were constitutional limits placed on the slave trade. So even though this document was written without saying the word slave, what this clause essentially said was, until 1808, the migration or importation of enslaved individuals of African descent cannot be regulated by the federal government, but only by the states, to allow for each entity to make the best economic decision for their white citizens. At the end of the day, Southern states were able to benefit by keeping their property, and Northern states, we shouldn't forget, also got to benefit from the impact of slavery on the Northern economy. The Slave Trade Clause prevented action on the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years, and the Three-Fifths Compromise lasted for a lot longer than that.
Now, it's like I told you, it wasn't about some kind of moral thing. This was about trying to make this a white nation. But they understood that their whole economy, right, their whole foundation was based off of slavery, so they couldn't just ban it. All of these people who's writing this document is slave owners themselves. And I'm not sure if either one of them released any of their slaves in their own lifetime. But anyway, during their Revolutionary War, a lot of black people managed to escape from slavery. And, they were preoccupied with the war. And they also stopped doing business with the British. So it slowed down the slave trade. So to replace the slave population in the southern states with the places with the most plantations, they started importing a whole lot of people. Now, even though the Constitution didn't mention the word slave in it, they did have another clause that actually referred to slaves, which was called the Fugitive from Labor Clause. And pretty much it just said if somebody ran away to a state that banned slavery, that the residents in that state were required to return the slave to their owner. Now, by this time, it was actually becoming a debate about whether they should have slavery in the new territories or not. The territory that they had won during their Revolutionary War. And eventually, they agreed on what they called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
The Northwest Ordinance guaranteed rights to the people, such as freedom of religion, and the right to a trial by jury. Education would be encouraged, and Indians would be treated in good faith. The Northwest Ordinance also banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance also established a three-step plan for admitting states from the Northwest Territory, like Ohio, to the United States. First, Congress would appoint a group of leaders to govern people in the territory. Within minimum population, the people part of the territory could elect political leaders to govern them. When the population of the district was large enough, it could be admitted as a state, like Ohio was in 1803. Political leaders in Ohio wrote Ohio's first constitution so Ohio could become a state. Ohio's constitution was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. Some land from the Northwest Territory was granted to Revolutionary War veterans as compensation for their service.
Now, their ordinance essentially made the Ohio River the dividing line between free and slave states. But the territory that eventually became Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan all outlawed slavery. Now, keep in mind, these states could still do whatever they wanted to do, first of all, and they still had to return anybody who escaped from slavery, right? And if somebody came to that state with a slave, right, they still could practice the same slavery they always have. But anyway, like I said, if you want to learn a lot more about this part of it, you can study American history all you want, right? But their constitution was not officially ratified until 1788, after 9 states finally adopted it. Now, even though New York was one of the colonies that accepted it, they continued to create slave laws and said that anybody who was enslaved on that date already would be a slave for life. But in Boston, after the free black community heard about their constitution, they started petitioning for free schools for black children. And of course, you know, they already had their mutual aid societies putting their money together, building their schools, right? And, you know, after all of these years, we know the importance of educating our own children. We understand that after all of this experience. But, you know, at this time, black people see the Constitution like, oh, well, all men are created equal. And they begin petitioning for, you know, free black schools in Boston. And up in New York, the African Free School was founded that year.
But it's a fascinating subject, and there's not a lot on it in the secondary literature, and it is a story crying to be told. In 1785, in New York City, a group of white Quakers and Federalist politicians that included Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of Treasury, and John Jay, the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, formed the New York Manumission Society, an organization dedicated to the gradual extinction of slavery in New York State and to the improvement of the conditions of the free people of African descent. 2 years later, in 1787, that same Manumission Society established the first benevolent society school for blacks in the state. This free African school, as they called it, would later multiply into several schools and eventually evolve into the city's black public education system. The Manumission Society members believed that education would reduce white prejudice against blacks and thereby work toward ending enslavement. The lesson plan, therefore, at the school focused more on what whites called moral improvement, piety, frugality, and the work ethic. More on that than it did on spelling, penmanship, grammar, and astronomy, although those were included. I was very interested in the astronomy aspect of it, and from what I can gather, that had to do with the fact that so many black men went to sea. I don't quite get the relationship, but I saw that in some of the literature. It was also believed that since blacks would only become domestics, laborers, waiters, and the like, there was no need to educate them beyond the upper elementary grades.
Now, even though this Manumission Society, you know, created the free black school, right? We talked about John Jay, its founder, and, you know, some of his views and how he never let go of his slaves, right? But, you know, the Free African School was founded that year. And down south in Georgia, former and current slaves came together to form their own church, which we talked a little bit about before, with the First African Baptist Church of Savannah. Because, the people were already congregating, the brother was already preaching before, they became an official kind of congregation. Now, the First African Baptist Church of Savannah played a huge role when it came to, the Underground Railroad. Because, people always talk about, white abolitionists and all of this stuff. But, most of the abolitionists and Underground Railroad participants were other black people. And, churches and organizations like this helped a whole lot of people during that time. Because even though the Underground Railroad didn't reach its height until like the 1840s and 1850s, and, we know it by people like the great Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad as a network was actually being formed, they say as early as 1789 and probably earlier than that. But it started increasing as, more of the northern states at least made gradual emancipation laws. But the First African Baptist Church, and other churches and organizations played a big role in that.
If you were a slave living in Georgia 150 years ago, freedom may have seemed like an impossible dream. But many slaves found freedom. Some had guides to help them along. Others found their own way. But for all of them, freedom meant having the courage to run away. This is the First African Baptist Church in Savannah. The church began in 1773 and is considered to be the oldest black congregation in North America. The First African Baptist Church also served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. This wasn't a real railroad, but it was very secret and very dangerous. The Underground Railroad was a series of paths to the north. Along the way, people helped slaves escape to freedom by giving them food and clothes and hiding them until they were able to move to the next safe place. In the basement of First African Baptist Church, there are holes cut in patterns on the floor. These holes provided air for the runaway slaves who sometimes hid beneath the boards.
These were the ventilation holes for fugitive slaves that would have hid out beneath this floor. And there's not even 2 feet of clearance up under this floor here. So it's a very narrow, And just imagine, you may have had to stay beneath this floorboard for some time, at least until it was clear for you to go to another point.
There were many different ways a slave could run away.
Or to steal themselves. That's what they actually call it, to steal yourself. I mean, if you want to go to freedom, they say, well, so-and-so stole themselves. A lot of times the slave got aboard just through the fields, because if you're picking, and there's woods at the end of each field, right? That was where they got on board of the Underground Railroad. They would be picking, and master and overseer would be out there, and then when they get to the edge of the woods, they'll be gone.
There were many secret codes on the Underground Railroad, secret passwords or lights telling fugitives when things were safe and when they needed to hide. Songs were another way of passing along information. Runaway slaves traveled mostly by night, and sometimes they hid in cemeteries.
Well, the cemeteries were obvious places because everyone's afraid of a cemetery. Who lives in cemeteries? Dead people live in cemeteries. Ghosts hide in cemeteries. No one wants to go in a cemetery to find anybody.
The Underground Railroad ran to the north, to free states and to Canada. But many slaves found freedom on their own by heading south to Florida. The swamps were good places to hide, and here they lived with the Seminole Indians.
And it is said that the slave catchers who would proceed to try to catch escaped slaves, that if you went into the Okefenokee Swamp, it was rare that a slave catcher came back out alive.
Then the elements. I mean, you risked the sunshine, the heat of the day, you risked the chill of the night, you risked winter, you risked being shot, you risked being hung. If you were a slave on the run, you could be accused of anything. You can be caught, you could be hung right there on the spot.
And still, and still they had the courage to escape.
Freedom. Freedom is the most important thing. The ability to just go somewhere and be your own master. Able to have my own family, my own children. Able to control my own life. I mean, no more lashes, no more chains.
Now, that same year, in 1789, a former slave, Olaudah Equiano, published his autobiography. Now, I know it's debates in modern times about his writings, but it's known as one of the earliest black writings that was published that highlighted the experience of a slave from a first-hand account.
After being freed, former slave Olaudah Equiano, who was active in the abolition movement in England in the 18th century, wrote about his experiences. When it came to his journey on a slave ship, he described the initial confusion and shock he felt. According to Equiano, he wasn't sure if the white men were going to kill him or eat him. Once he was on board, he saw, in his own words, a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow. He was so terrified, he fainted.
Now, of course, Equiano went on a campaign to kind of convince Europeans of their ways, but, this is a campaign that we still are unsuccessful with to this day. But anyway, in Jamaica that year, the Drax Free School was created, but enslaved children, of course, was not allowed to go or get an education at all. Now, even though in this little window right here, a lot of states are leaning towards gradual emancipation laws as far as slavery, the pro-slavery propaganda was also on the rise. They promoted popular plays like this play called The Benevolent Planners, which they used to show how slavery was necessary. Now, that's when they elected, the criminal George Washington to be their first president. And, they elected him while he owned over 200 slaves at the time. George Washington wrote that anti-slavery petitions were not only ill-judged, but a waste of time. Now, in 1790, America took its first census, and black people made up 19% of the population, according to them. Now, out of all the black people in America, only 9% of that total population of black people was considered free. In Virginia alone, the enslaved population went from 100,000 in 1756 to 200,000 by 1790. And by that time, that number was close to 293,000 enslaved people on record, right? The most of any colony at that particular time. According to their records, America had a total population of 4 million, which included over 697,600 enslaved people, right? Enslaved black people. And that's compared to just over 59,500 free black people. But, that's who they included on their census. Now, most of the free black population, especially in Virginia, lived in the Chesapeake area. And they established their own free black communities out there.
An obscure neighborhood in eastern Maryland is actually the oldest continuously occupied African American community in all of America. Who knew? So we decided to send Scott Broom out to find out more information.
This neighborhood in eastern Maryland surrounding the Bethel AME Church, which is the oldest African American church in Maryland, is called The Hill. First settled by freed African Americans in the 1790s, it's still here. Some little pockets of poverty accented by rehabbed historic homes.
I don't know, it's just like living anywhere else.
Marshall Johnson is an Eastern Shore native, the land of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, history to the 1600s. If you're looking for early black history in America, the Eastern Shore is the place. Which is why The Hill, a neighborhood near the art galleries and high-end bed and breakfasts of Easton, is so significant. Professor Wade Green of Morgan State University is documenting the place.
It is America's oldest free black community that is still in existence and still continuously occupied. Wherever you go in history, you will find that there are black people who have made contributions, but their contributions have been lost they've been buried, and they've been obscured. And the Hill community's history and significance is no different than that. So it was their faith that enabled them to be strong, influential.
Archaeologists have been busy in the yards of the homes and churches here. One stunning find, an exceptionally rare 1795 Liberty Cap penny, only 15 of them known in the world, the image from Roman times celebrating the freedom of slaves, perhaps carried as a memento by a freed African American here.
As long as they keep digging, sooner or later they're going to find something.
The free African Americans of the Eastern Shore sometimes were emancipated by Quakers for religious reasons. Sometimes they bought their own freedom long before Lincoln and the Civil War. And their history still lives here in the Hill.
Now, before we make this session too long, right, I just want to point out a few more things before we end it. By the 1790s, America was going through what they called the Second Great Awakening, and a lot of black people got caught up in it. Now, after this quote-unquote Second Great Awakening, a lot of free and enslaved black people, right, and, a lot of people got it beaten into them, right, let's be honest. But a lot of free and enslaved black people chose to adopt Christianity, right? And after 1790, right, the number of black Christians went up by 12,000, which is also going to contribute to the churches that we're going to see in upcoming lessons. But, we're starting to see everything get blended up, even with our religion.
The two great awakenings, the one in the 1740s and then another one in the early 1800s, were significant in both for blacks and for whites. For whites, because it began to getting serious about religion, began to make them question all of those inconsistencies that they began to see between slavery and Christianity, as well as other aspects of their society, such as alcohol consumption and other things leading to teetotaler movements. For the slaves, the two awakenings were extremely important because in the excitement of the awakenings, when people were falling out in trance and people were jerking and people were dancing, they found an equivalent to something that was important in African religion, that is religious ecstasy. If you look at the Latin American colonies, if you look at Cuba or the other areas of the Caribbean or Brazil, slaves found in the saints, Catholic saints, an identification that they could make with their African gods. There was nothing like that in Protestant North America. But what Protestant North America did have in the awakenings was several moments in time when religious ecstasy, danced religion in which one became possessed by the Spirit, as it were, now the Holy Spirit, not an African spirit, but it's a spirit nonetheless. Slaves saw in this something that was very familiar to them. So this became their way of finding a parallel, finding something similar to the religious traditions of their people.
And like I said, we can have a conversation about this if you want to talk about it. And I'm sure, this is going to come up again when we start getting into stuff like the AME Church and the role that the early black churches played, especially when it came to mutual aid societies. And, we just saw with the Underground Railroad. But, to finish up with this lesson, right, and as we going through like the origin of, their country, they eventually chose D.C. to be their capital. Now, even though they're going to give Europeans credit, it was Benjamin Banneker who came up with the design for the city of Washington, D.C.
Benjamin Banneker, the architect of Washington, D.C., who I believe is one of the most overlooked black STEM figures in American history. Banneker was born on November 9, 1731, to freed slaves in Baltimore County, Maryland. He went on to become a self-taught inventor, mathematician, astronomer, and surveyor. Banneker went on to build his own version of a clock made of wood that ticked accurately for decades. He accurately predicted solar eclipses and created almanacs that helped farmers predict weather patterns over a long period of time. He also used almanacs as a form of protest, where he would include letters challenging white supremacy. Most notably, he wrote a letter to then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson questioning his commitment to liberty because Jefferson was a slave owner. Banneker's most impressive work, in my opinion, is his involvement in designing Washington, D.C. Banneker was shortlisted to work as a surveyor on the project where he mapped out the boundaries of the new federal city. During the project, the architect Pierre Laflante was dismissed and the plans went with him. Banneker redrew every road, stream, and building from memory. He may not have been the visionary for Washington, D.C., but because his memorized drawings were accepted, he, in my opinion, is and should be credited for designing Washington, D.C.
Now, they say this white dude who was the lead designer, but once he got fired or he quit or whatever, he took the plans with him. Now, they're saying Benjamin Banneker recreated the design within 2 days, but, you know, to be honest with you, he was probably the smartest person in that room to begin with, right? And who knows what ideas or whatever he put into it, which is probably why the dude quit in the first place. And likely he did his own thing, maybe used other ideas, but added his own flavor into it. But, you know, that's just my speculation. But anyway, like many black inventors, Benjamin Banneker didn't get recognized for the many things that he did. And just like all aspects of society, black people were forced to create their own and help each other out, like we mentioned before with the mutual aid societies. But there were a couple of other non-white groups who white people would have even considered Negroes, who felt like they needed to create their own mutual aid societies and stay within themselves. Because it's interesting, even during the 1700s, mixed race people was creating their own groups and separating themselves from black people in America. One example was the Brown Fellowship Society in Charleston, South Carolina, who limited their membership to mixed people only.
The black-white binary was ill-matched to American realities where racial lines grew blurrier with each generation. But in Charleston, it was particularly anathema. Yet after the nation was founded, the Caribbean-inflected distinctiveness of early Carolina waned. In 1790, not 15 years into American independence, St. Philip's Episcopal Church, the oldest and most prestigious congregation in Charleston, where the white elite and their free mixed-race relatives had worshipped for generations under the same roof, announced that it was prohibiting its mixed-race members from being buried in the church graveyard. Mixed-race people might be free, but they wouldn't be equal. In response to their church's decree that they were good enough to worship, even marry in the church, but not good enough to be buried there, the mixed-race relatives of Charleston's leading white families organized themselves into a separate sub-congregation, the Brown Fellowship Society. By October 1794, the Brown Fellowship Society had raised enough money to purchase a plot of land to use as a burial ground, solving the immediate crisis that had sparked its founding, and it threw open the new cemetery to the entire free mixed-race community of Charleston. Taking on broad communal responsibility over time, the society sponsored a school, founded a credit union, and organized a life insurance fund. For all the institutions it created, the Brown Fellowship Society's greatest creation was the community itself. The society made brownness a communal identity, elevating it into a racial category, at least within the city limits of Charleston. By doing so, the originators hoped to carve out a space for their community in the social and political minefield that was being free and mixed race in an America with a looming Manichaean black-white racial order.
Now, this mixed group of people referred to themselves as brown and refused to be called black, and definitely separated themselves from black people. They refused to get involved in any kind of slavery issues because they didn't want to piss off their white side. And, you know, some of them were children or the relatives of slave owners. And a lot of them were free and they had the same mindset. They attended the same churches. They could get married in them. But, you know, they start saying, well, you're not a white person, right? When they start getting this American white nationalist identity. Even though some of them could pass for white and had slaves themselves. But since they got excluded from the white side, they didn't want to be bothered with the black side. So they made their own and called themselves brown. Now, as much as they wanted to be accepted and recognized by whites, at least of being in a higher class than us regular black folk, but Congress was busy making white nationalism official in America. And in 1790, they passed the first immigration law in America, which was the Naturalization Act of 1790.
I'm going to give you a brief overview of citizenship rights in early America. Who was considered a citizen? Did having citizenship mean that you had the right to vote? How did citizenship and voting rights change over time? So let's go back to the beginning when the U.S. Constitution took effect in 1789. Shortly thereafter, Congress passed the first Federal Naturalization Act of 1790. Remember that naturalization is the process by which someone becomes a citizen. That act said that any free white person of good character could be a U.S. citizen. They had to live in the United States for 2 years. Later, they changed it to 5 years. And in the state where they applied for citizenship for at least 1 year, and then take an oath to support the Constitution. Who did that include, and who did it exclude? Any white man who wasn't an indentured servant was eligible to become a citizen, and therefore enjoy all of the protections listed in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Single or widowed white women could become citizens on their own. Married white women and the children of naturalized citizens also inherited citizenship from their husbands and fathers. Having U.S. citizenship didn't automatically mean that you could vote. States control elections, not the federal government, and most states at this time had property requirements for voting. The Naturalization Act of 1790 excluded a lot of people who lived in the United States from being eligible for citizenship. Indigenous people were not eligible to become citizens. People of African descent, both those who were enslaved and those who were free, were not eligible to become citizens. Although some states did permit free black men to own property and vote if they met those property requirements. That shows us another example of how voting rights and citizenship were not necessarily intertwined. However, over the course of the next 40 years or so, whiteness became more and more synonymous with voting rights in the United States. By the 1830s, almost all states had removed their property requirements for voting and instead permitted any free white man over the age of 21 to vote. And as state legislatures rewrote these laws, the states that had permitted propertied black men to vote now outlawed them from doing so.
Now, the Naturalization Act only granted citizenship to free white persons of good character. Now, of course, we know who they let into their club is a whole different category from what we know as white. But anyway, now that America was officially a white nation, many states adopted laws that required free black people to leave the state within a certain time or they be punished. And a lot of times that would be enslaving them. So we see the mindset that they have of making this a white nation. But at the same time, their whole economy and foundation is based off slavery, which they need black people for. And before we end this, is one more thing I want to make clear. That we should probably already know the thugs who wrote this Constitution never had us in mind whatsoever as far as it applying to us, because it was never meant for us. Charles Pickney, who was a slave owner who helped write the Constitution and signed it, he said at the time that they were writing it, he knew perfectly there was no such thing as a Negro citizen. And he couldn't possibly conceive it ever existing.
Now, if you're looking for a bad guy at the Constitutional Convention, I should introduce you to Charles Cotesworth
Pinckney. Debates arose over the threat slavery might pose to national security, with northern states not wanting a central government calling up their militias to put down slave revolts in the South. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney countered that the real threat to national security came from frontiersmen or New England fishermen. At one point in the convention, Pinckney claimed that banning the slave trade was unnecessary. South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade. In every proposed extension of the powers of Congress, the state has expressly and watchfully expected that of meddling with the importation of Negroes. If the states be all left at liberty on this subject, South Carolina may perhaps by degrees do of herself what is wished, as Virginia and Maryland have already done. After Mason's tirade on August 22nd, Pinckney claimed that South Carolina might abolish slavery on its own. If slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world. In all ages, one half of mankind have been slaves. He then went on to express a kind of conspiracy theory, claiming that Virginia wants to ban slaves in order to dominate the domestic slave trade. South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. As to Virginia, she will gain by stopping the importations. Her slaves will rise in value, and she has more than she wants. It would be unequal to require South Carolina and Georgia to confederate on such unequal terms. He then argued that continuing the trade would benefit the whole Union and not just the states that continued the practice. He contended that the importation of slaves would be for the interest of the whole Union. The more slaves, the more produced to employ the carrying trade, the more consumption also, and the more of this, the more revenue for the common treasury. James Wilson responded to Pinckney's claim that South Carolina and Georgia would abolish the trade on their own fairly soon. If South Carolina and Georgia were themselves disposed to get rid of the importation of slaves in a short time, as has been suggested, they would never refuse to unite because the importation might be prohibited. As the section now stands, all articles imported are to be taxed. Slaves alone are exempt. This is, in fact, a bounty on that article. Other delegates began voicing their opposition to allowing the slave trade to continue without either taxing the importation of them or taxing the exports of the products produced with their labor. So as you can see, Pinckney sucks, but he gets worse. Do you remember earlier when I said that in the notes on the Federal Convention, that there was no point in which they were talking about how human slaves were? Well, I need to make a correction there. They did talk about it once, and it was by Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. He claimed the value of black labor was only 3/5 that of whites, and therefore they should only be counted as 3/5 when it came to taxation. But when the discussion moved on to political representation, he argued that slaves should be counted in full, because they were just as human as whites. At this point, he got called out on his bullshit, and his motion to count all slaves for apportionment was rejected. You can get the full details of that exchange in the previous video. Before the convention was over, Pinckney had one last parting shot. Originally, the slave trade clause would allow the trade to continue until January 1st, 1800. But a couple days later, Pinckney decided to chime in again, and motions to amend the clause to prolong the slave trade until January 1st, 1808.
Now, we'll end it right there, but, they're clear that their constitution, their country, is about white nationalism from the start. And it was never meant for us. When they was talking about citizenship, they couldn't conceive of a Negro being a citizen. The so-called white abolitionists that a lot of people like to praise, today, we would just call them white nationalists. But, we'll end it, and we kind of got through, from the beginning of their revolution to the beginning of their country, right? And we'll kind of move forward with the next lessons that's coming up. And next time, we'll mention the beginnings of the Haitian Revolution, because a lot of people get the 1804 date, but, the Haitian Revolution was a long time coming. I think we'll finally get to, y'all first president, George Washington, and see if he ever told a lie and really examine the lies that he did tell. And you know what? This is an interesting time because now we also going to see the introduction of the cotton gin. And as terrible and horrible as slavery was to this point, after the cotton gin, it goes to a whole nother level. So, we'll pick up on some of that stuff next week. And I appreciate all of y'all for y'all support. And again, I encourage anybody to make their own course, whatever that course may be, but anything to help our youth learn and get on a new path. Use these platforms to our advantage, right? So I encourage everybody to go out there and just contribute something that can further us. And of course, if you have any questions or you disagree or you want to add something or I missed something, feel free to ask or let me know. And I appreciate y'all. And I'll see y'all with the next lesson. And as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.